How does one determine when day ends and night begins in extreme northern latitudes? When is Zman Kriyat Shema and when is Zman Tzet HaShabbat?
The first thing to know is that this question of when the day ends and the night begins is discussed by Chazal, is discussed by the Tanaim and the Amoraim in both Talmudim. And the definition of certain Chachamim is different from that of other Chachamim. In other words, there was no consensus regarding this question of when the day ends and the night begins. Without going into all the details and the various opinions amongst the Tanaim and the Amoraim, we can state clearly and categorically that the halacha is in both Talmudim. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, this is to be found at the beginning of Masechet Berachot, in the Talmud Bavli, in Masechet Shabbat, Daf Lamed Hey, page 35b. It is clear that the halacha is as follows, that the clear and unequivocal indication that night has arrived, that the day has ended and night has begun, is the appearance of 3 stars in the sky. Now, it goes without saying that when we speak of the appearance of stars, of 3 stars in the evening sky, that does not mean, of course, that the stars appear from nowhere. In fact, we all know the stars are there all the time. We just cannot see them because of the light of the sun. And it is necessary for the sun to drop below the horizon after sunset, down to a certain number of degrees below the horizon. In other words, the ambient light in the sky, in the western horizon where the sun set, and essentially the entire sky, the sky has to achieve a certain level of darkness for us to be able to perceive those 3 stars that appear at the beginning of the evening. And this can be calculated and described in very precise terms as a certain number of degrees at the center of the sun is a certain number of degrees below the horizon, and that is the definition, or that is the time when enough light has dissipated and left the sky, and therefore the sky is now dark to the point that these stars can be seen. Now, it also goes without saying that this occurs at different times in different countries. That is to say, the time that elapses between the setting of the sun and the appearance of the first 3 average-sized stars in the sky. I will explain in a moment what we mean by average. The time between sunset and the appearance of the stars in the evening sky differs from place to place on the face of the earth, depending on the latitude. For example, here in Eretz Yisrael, even in the middle of summer, when the days are the longest, and the Ben Hashem period, the twilight period between night and day, is the longest, the time between sunset and the appearance of 3 stars is no more than a little bit more perhaps than half an hour, but not more than that in Eretz Yisrael. So even in the middle of summer, Tzet HaKochavim, the appearance of the stars, is perhaps 32 minutes, 33 minutes at the most, after the sun sets. However, in countries that are further to the north, the time between these 2 astronomical events, between the sunset and the appearance of the stars, of those 3 stars, is longer. For example, in Budapest, which is the capital of Hungary, which is further north than Eretz Yisrael certainly, but not that far north, the time between that first event, the sunset and the stars appearing, is 1 whole hour. It's double the time that it takes in Eretz Yisrael for that that level of darkness to appear in the evening sky. If one goes even further north to a country such as Norway, for example, then the time is first of all very much lengthened indeed. First of all, in the middle of summer, the sun sets in a country like Norway, even in the southern part of Norway. The sun sets very, very late. In the middle of the summer, late June, early July, the longest days of the year, the sun sets just a few minutes before 11 p.m. However, the issue becomes even more complex when it comes to defining nightfall in such a place as Norway, for example, because the further north one goes, and this is also true in the opposite direction, the further south one goes, towards the South Pole, the longer the day is, and the twilight, the time between night and day, where there is still light in the sky, and there is until one would expect to see total darkness as the sign of nightfall. Such a time is very much delayed. In fact, in a country such as Norway, there is no such time. In the middle of summer, it's very dubious whether one can actually find 3 stars in the sky. And this is because the light from the sun, which does dip below the horizon, there is a sunset in that part of Norway. If one goes to the much further north in Norway, then the sun does not set at all. Then you have the midnight sun, which never sets. But even in the southern parts of Norway, where the sun does set, it only sets to a certain number of degrees below the horizon, and then it begins to rise once again. And therefore there is a lot of light in the evening sky. It never gets completely dark. And some days of the year one cannot see clearly 3 stars, or at least it's very, very borderline. It's not a certain thing. Sometimes what one thinks as a star is perhaps a planet, such as Mars or Jupiter or Venus, and in which case a planet does not count as one of the 3 stars. So really we are presented with the following problem. In a place where 3 stars do not appear because the evening sky remains lit to the point that stars are not really visible, how does one define nightfall? So let us recap for a moment. We said that the halachic definition, according to both Talmudim, of night is the appearance of 3 average-size stars in the evening sky. Let us also briefly discuss what we mean by average-sized stars. The Talmud discusses small stars, medium stars, and large stars. Large stars are a reference to heavenly bodies that can be seen immediately after the sun sets, and sometimes even before the sun sets, such as Venus or Mars, because they are much closer to us and relatively very bright. They're not actually stars, as we know, they are planets, but they're referred to as kochavim because they are celestial bodies similar to the stars from our perspective. Such bodies, even if they are seen shortly after the sun sets, do not count for one of the 3 stars. This is a common reality with regards to Venus, for example. Venus, sometimes of the year, as we know, is an evening star, and sometimes, some period of the year, is a morning star. In other words, it can be seen clearly in the morning before the sun rises in the east, above the eastern horizon, and sometimes of the year it is visible in the evening, immediately after the sun sets, just above the western horizon, and sometimes much higher than just above the horizon. At any rate, it looks to us as a very bright star, and it does not count as one of the stars because it is too bright and therefore visible too early to be a reliable indication. We need to have 3 average stars. What are average stars? Even though some poskim claim that we do not know what an average star is, and therefore we have to wait longer until we see 3 small stars, this claim is somewhat dubious, and it is clear that many of the Rishonim do not agree with such an idea. 3 average stars simply means the kind of stars that we are able to observe without difficulty at the beginning of the evening. But that's Shlosha Kochavim Benonim, 3 average stars. As opposed to what, you ask? As opposed to Shlosha Kochavim Ketanim, Sheinam Nirim Ela Balayla, as it states in the Talmud. 3 very faint stars that can only be seen at night. At night means when it's completely dark, because after the appearance of 3 stars, or at that point, the sky is not completely bereft of light. It still takes quite some time for all the light from the sun, which is well below the horizon by this time, to dissipate and disappear completely from the sky. And that, in fact, is the time known as Tzedek Kochavim of Rabbeinu Tam. Without going into the details here, it is a fact, an astronomical fact, that at some point the entire sky from the eastern horizon, which of course gets darker before the western horizon where the sun sets, the entire sky is completely dark. And that is when one can see certain faint stars quite clearly, relatively well, which were not so obvious and sometimes invisible altogether sometime earlier than that point in the evening. So when the Talmud discusses Kochavim Ketanim Sheinam Nirim Ela Balayla, it refers to the very faint stars which you do not see clearly at the beginning of the evening, but shall we say 45 minutes to an hour later you do see quite clearly. You're able to see quite clearly. Shlosha Kochavim Benoniyim, the average 3 stars that we need to look for, are the kind of stars that become apparent to us at the beginning of the evening, the first 3 reasonable sized stars that we can detect. Now, as we discussed before, at what point exactly in time we are able to observe these 3 average sized stars in the evening sky is a function of the degree of darkness that exists at that moment, which is a function of the astronomical position of the sun, that is to say, how far below the horizon the sun is. And that point of time when those 3 stars are visible defines night, because that is considered a sufficient degree of darkness. That is dark enough to consider it nighttime, even though it is not 100% dark. If we wished to wait for complete and total darkness throughout the visible sky, then we would have to wait something like 45 minutes or at least half an hour longer in order to be able to say that there is absolutely no light in the sky, whatever. But that is not the requirement of the halacha. It is sufficient that the darkness be such that we are able to see 3 stars. In countries in extreme northern latitudes where that degree of darkness simply does not occur in the middle of summer, then we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to define the night, the end of the day and the beginning of the next day? Because in the Torah, according to the Torah, each day begins at nightfall. That one day begins when night is certainly now considered night, and till the next evening, that is considered one day. It is reasonable to suggest, even though this is not explicitly mentioned by Chazal, this is not discussed in the Talmud or in any of the medieval Halachic Posekim, the Rishonim, it is reasonable to suggest that midnight is the point that we can refer to as the definite end of the day and the beginning of the night, and therefore of the next day. Why? Because that point in time is the darkest that the sky is going to be. It will not become darker than that point of midnight. Midnight, of course, is exactly 12 hours after midday. Midday or midnight is simply the midpoint between sunrise and sunset. Between sunrise in the morning, sunset in the evening, that's midday, the midpoint. And at night, midnight is the midpoint between set in the evening and the sun rise the next morning. The time that can be defined as therefore as midnight in northerly latitudes, of course, varies. In a country, again, like Norway, shall we say, even in the southern parts of Norway, in the middle of summer, midnight is 1:30 in the morning approximately. And even then it is far from dark. The sky does not become totally dark. The eastern part of the sky is darker. One would say sort of a deep, fairly deep blue color, but not completely dark. And the western part of the sky is lit up the entire night by the light of the sun that set, but did not drop very far below the horizon. So therefore midnight is the longest or the last point that we can refer to as belonging to the previous day, and therefore the night is now beginning, because from this point on it will only get lighter, and there is no point, or there's nothing to be gained by waiting any further. In fact, one only loses by waiting further, because it does not become darker, it becomes lighter from that point on. So Sefer Kochavim in such a latitude should be defined as midnight, as the darkest point that is observable, the darkest, the least light apparent in the sky, the greatest degree of darkness that is apparent in the evening or in the middle of the night in that part of the world, and that is midnight, and that therefore should be defined as equivalent to Sefer Kochavim. That is to say, instead of the appearance of stars. Depending on the latitude, one can perhaps just barely make out 3 stars at that time, and sometimes not. It depends exactly where one is situated. And the same holds true for Mosai Shabbat. Shabbat needs to be, one has to wait to do melacha on Mosai Shabbat until that point of midnight, which is the darkest point of the night. And therefore, if a person finds themselves in such a locality and they want to go to sleep, they can go to sleep and they need to do Havdalah the following morning, which is entirely possible, as is discussed explicitly in the Talmud and in all the Posukim. It is possible to make Havdalah on Sunday morning, shall we say, instead of waiting up till the middle of the night to make Havdalah. With regards to davening minha or arvith in such localities, one needs to know that if one davens minha before placha minha, which in a very northerly latitude can easily be 9 o'clock in the evening, then, which is an easy thing to do, therefore it's easy to let's say daven mincha at 8:30 or 8, and then one can immediately after placha mincha daven arvith. I refer here to arvith, that is to say the Shmoneh Esrei, and not to Kriyat Shema. Kriyat Shema, if one can, one should wait till midnight. One can go to sleep and wake up, which is not ideal, but we have limited options in such a situation. One could perhaps make the claim that with regards to Zaman Kriyat Shema, which depends on Zaman Shechiva, when people normally go to sleep, that in such places, certainly people go to sleep by 11 o'clock or something like that, and one could make the claim that is a reasonable hour to say Kriyat Shema, but this claim is, although reasonable, it is a svara that makes sense. On the other hand, it is not absolutely certain that this is so. If possible, it's better to say Kriyat Shema, wait for midnight to come along, which of course is difficult in such a latitude. And if someone says, well, it's very difficult to be a Jew in such a part of the world, I would say, yes, that's entirely true. The Torah was not intended for such latitudes. It is not always straightforward to live as a Jew in such places. I should also point out that when speaking of waiting for midnight to come around, really, what this means is that one should say Kriyat Shema immediately at that point in time, at midnight, and not wait much beyond that time, because from that point on it only becomes lighter. So it begins to be something akin to, similar to Alot HaShahar, even though there is really no Alot HaShahar in such latitudes, because it never gets completely dark, and therefore Alot HaShahar, which is the first light visible on the eastern horizon in the early morning, such a phenomenon does not exist. But it is clear that it is only at that midpoint of the night that one can say with certainty this is the darkest point of the night. Another thing that should be mentioned is that in such a situation one can and should say Arvit on Motzei Shabbat after Plaga Mincha, which, as we said before, can be very, very late, 9 or even later than that at night, and one may and must say during Arvith, one says Havdalah in Birkat Hunan Hada'at, Hata Hunan Tanu, or whatever other nusach one uses. This is explicitly mentioned in the Talmud Bavli, in Masechet Berachot Daf Kav Zayin, and this is explicitly mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Resh Samech Zayin and Siman Resh Sadi Gimel, speaking about davening earlier on Friday, before Shabbat enters, saying Arvith early and saying Arvith Shel Motzei Shabbat when it is still Shabbat. This is definitely possible, and in fact it's the correct thing to do. What we said before about waiting till a later time we refer there to Kriyat Shema, not to the Shmoneh Esrei. These are some of the issues that present themselves to a Torah Jew who finds himself in such latitudes and such localities in the middle of summer, during the very long days and very short nights and the very brightly lit nights that occur in such places.
The production of these videos and maintaining this channel demands much time and money. If you enjoyed this video, please show your appreciation and support. To make a donation, please go to www.machonshilo.org and press the PayPal button, which appears on the upper right-hand side of the home page. To sponsor a video or purchase Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael, please write us at office@machonshilo.org.